We've all heard about how the rise of cancel culture and all the rest of it has led to more and more censorship. Some of it imposed by publishers or platform owners, some of it the self-censorship that comes with worrying about the loss of the approval of your peer group, or worse. In principle, the last place that should make itself felt is in science. The peer-reviewed scientific literature is all meant to be about going wherever the evidence takes you. But recently a paper was produced bearing the names of nearly 40 authors, including a few well-known names such as Steven Pinker and Philip Tetlock, looking more carefully at the evidence of censorship in science. It's the sort of thing that some people don't want to talk about because trust in science has gone down in recent years, and there's no shortage of rather loud people who will seize upon any such work to justify their desire to disregard any scientific truths that they find not to their taste. Ironically, that's exactly one of the sorts of self-censorship that's the entire point of the conversation. So let's ignore that, we'll dive in and discuss it anyway. And that's what we're going to do in this video. We are a species prone to contradictions and uncertainties. Well, it kind of makes us interesting. The iconic American poet Walt Whitman once wrote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And so it is that while the scientific method is arguably humanity's greatest achievement, scientific censorship is hardly ever studied using the scientific method. Hence why this paper is rather interesting and, given the state of our public discourse, reasonably timely. And as it states early on, the fundamental principle of science is that evidence, not authority, tradition, rhetorical eloquence, or social prestige, should triumph. This commitment makes science a radical force in society, challenging and disrupting sacred myths, cherished beliefs, and socially desirable narratives. The paper notes that this means that science exists in tension with other institutions, often provoking hostility and censorship. And you should reflect on that, particularly at this point in history. Right now, in public political discourse in the United States, you have Democrats believing one thing, for instance, about climate change, and on another instance about vaccines, and Republicans believing something else entirely. Now, whatever else we do or don't think about individual scientific questions and the policy implications people can draw from them, surely we can all agree that if belief in a scientific question falls along party political lines, it's a clear indication that our public debate isn't being led by the actual evidence. Climate change, COVID-19, human biology, and asteroids from space for that matter, all have at least one thing in common. None of them care about your political opinions or indeed your group identity. So on every specific question, the people who are right, as well as the people who are wrong, and it's not always the same people on either side, by the way, are not right and wrong because they did a sober and objective analysis of the evidence in the scientific literature. They got it from their peer group principally, that, and they followed the gut instincts that typify their overall world view that they have in common with that peer group. Exactly the sort of thing that science aims to present the better alternative to. Although since scientists are themselves human, it does so within a community that's also prone to the same sorts of failings and has to deal with that. This paper says that modern-day censorship is often driven by pro-social concerns and by scientists. Pro-social in this context is defined as behaviour which is positive, helpful and intended to promote social acceptance and friendship. In this context, that is often about preventing harm to others. We hear a lot about harm to vulnerable groups in these discussions. Generally, if you asked a bunch of scientists, they would probably repeat the hypothesis that scientific censorship is rarer today than it was in the past. The most famous example of the past, of course, was Galileo, who was punished for promoting his view that the Earth orbits the Sun and that we are not the actual centre of the universe, as was the norm belief of the time. You could also go to the more recent examples of Kinsey's research into sex. A 1948 survey of clinical psychologists found that 17% of men and 25% of women wanted Kinsey's sexuality work censored. Some of those psychologists even then expressed their view in terms of that pro-social imperative, moral concerns about vulnerable groups. One, for example, who said, "This book," by which he meant the Kinsey report, "is already having a corrupting influence on the young, the suggestible, the weak." The thing is, given that the size of the scientific community has grown so much in recent decades, and given that there are now so many areas where scientific research has become the underpinning for disputed public policy, it would be actually surprising if there wasn't more censorship, not less, in the modern era than in the past. Now, okay, divine censorship. Well, the paper defines scientific censorship specifically as this: actions aimed at obstructing particular scientific ideas from reaching an audience for reasons other than low scientific quality. This is distinct from discrimination. Censorship targets ideas, discrimination targets people. Both of them are bad, but only one of them is our focus in this video. One can argue that there is a soft form of censorship that comes from selection. Just as an example, I talk about certain issues on this channel. I choose not to talk about other issues. On what basis? Well, purely and simply put, what I personally find to be important and of interest to me. It's not that I'm aiming to suppress discussion of other topics, it's just that I'm not particularly personally interested in them. And if that applies to me, it applies to you, who chooses what videos to watch, and realistically it will apply to some extent to the editors of scientific journals and academics, what is considered worthy of study and what, in contrast, is considered to be uninteresting, unimportant. That can be a significant driver of censorship, especially if the priorities so awarded turn out not to be well grounded in reality. This paper's authors produced a taxonomy of scientific censorship that they found in their review. They identified two types of censorship: hard censorship by institutions such as governments, universities, academic journals, professional societies, exerting their power to prevent the dissemination of ideas, and soft censorship, social punishments or threats of them, such as ostracism or reputational damage. Censors or would-be censors include governments, institutions, individuals, and the scientists themselves, the self-censorship. As for the motives of the censors, they found a spectrum, self-protection being the obvious one for self-censorship, self-enhancement, the virtue signalling phenomenon so massively amplified by modern social media, benevolence, aiming to protect the target of censorship from negative consequences, and then that pro-social characteristic, protecting third parties from harm from the censored content. Or indeed punitive, aiming to control a narrative and punish the target of the censorship. By the way, don't be tempted to downgrade how powerful ostracism and reputational damage can be as a motivator. Human beings depend massively on positive reputations. Facing backlash, some scholars have retracted their own papers even when they had no errors that had been identified. Such as this paper, for example. You may have spotted the very subtle notices on there saying that the paper has been retracted. What did the paper do? it analysed the race of police officers involved in fatal shootings and came to this conclusion, quote, "We find no evidence of anti-black or anti-Hispanic disparities across shootings, and white officers are not more likely to shoot minority civilians than non-white officers." That led to a number of outlets claiming the study had proven no bias at all in policing or police shootings, which goes slightly beyond what the paper actually deals with or claims. But that overclaiming led to a backlash against the paper, and instead of simply saying, "We stand by what the paper says, and we note that a bunch of people are losing their minds over things that it doesn't say," which is a very familiar thing that I've had from the comment section below these videos, they retracted it. Shouldn't be a surprise that a few of those in a row would lead a number of scientists to decide to just avoid that area of study altogether, which is the sort of censorship you can't measure and you can't report precisely. All you can do is note that nearly all US scientists report self-censoring their empirical beliefs somewhat, such as this study, where only 8% of all faculty surveyed say that they do not self-censor in any context. Bear in mind, bias is always something that has pushed back against the scientific method. Numerous scientific findings in history were vehemently opposed at the time they were first put forward, only to be eventually accepted when the evidence built up over time and then became overwhelming. We human beings, we are inherently biased creatures. Research has shown that people disproportionately search for, share, and remember preferred information, regardless of whether it's true or whether it's false. Likewise, people are selectively skeptical of information that is discordant with their prior beliefs. And it shouldn't be a surprise that scientists are not immune from those sorts of patterns as well. Science relies on peer review, but of course peer reviewers likewise evaluate research more favourably when it supports their prior beliefs. In one analysis of scientific papers, 96% of statistical errors that were identified favoured the scientists' hypotheses, suggesting that confirmation bias made them less sceptical of the data that went the right way, as far as they were concerned, while they were much more likely to pick up on errors that went the other way. But the process is powerful because, by and large, over time, it overcomes such biases and flawed ideas do eventually get discarded. So if this is all just the way it's always been, then is the perception that there's a growing problem here, is that just false? Is that recency bias, in fact? Not necessarily, because some important societal changes are taking place, particularly on that pro-social agenda. In modern times, the widespread availability and discussion of research has become much more of a thing than it ever was in the past, thanks to social media. But that has come at the same time as we have a current political fashion for expanding the definition of harm, particularly against what are described as vulnerable groups. Women are more censorious in the name of protecting the vulnerable. Egalitarian progressives are more censorious of information in relation to historically marginalized groups. Although standard progressives, not identity politics, woke progressives in other words, are less censorious than conservatives. Academics in the social sciences and humanities are more censorious and more censored than those in science, engineering, technology, and maths. So here's some of the data that comes from this paper. First, the frequency of incidents of targeted censorship per year, showing pretty starkly how much this has become a major issue in recent times. It would be nice if it turns out that it has really peaked in 2020 as the graph suggests. It's too early to tell for sure. The source of the targeting. Undergraduates significantly top the list, followed by activists, peer scholars, and administrators. After that, it declines more quickly, down through graduate students, the general public, and so on. The most frequent disciplines where scholars have been targeted over that recent period: history, law, political science, sociology. Those are the most censorious and censored areas, followed by philosophy, psychology, English, economics, education, biology, medicine, and anthropology. And the most common topics that prompted the controversies won't be a huge surprise to most people. Race, far and away number one. Gender, institutional policy, partisanship, religion, sexuality, law enforcement protests, health, socioeconomic status, free speech, and right there at the end, Israel and Palestine as a specific issue. The thing is that the phenomenon is making itself felt institutionally. Some journals are now explicitly citing moral concerns as valid reasons to suppress science. Nature Communications published an editorial recently promising that it was going to give more attention to potential harms in choosing what to publish. And a subsequent Nature editorial said that authors, reviewers, and editors must consider potentially harmful implications of research, and a Nature Human Behavior editorial stated that it might reject or retract articles that have the potential to undermine the dignities of human groups. These policies have started to focus on unspecified harms that could result from the dissemination of findings. As the authors of this study note, in effect, editors are granting themselves vast leeway to censor high-quality research that offends their own moral sensibilities. The problem, of course, is that if censorship becomes established on certain topics or issues, then the likelihood is greater that accurate information on those issues is suppressed and could be replaced by serious systemic misunderstandings. Rather illustrated by this diagram. Assuming that the evidence is all equally weighty, which, is an important caveat. It's not just licensed to give credence to junk science that you'd like to believe but has zero evidence supporting it, but assuming all the evidence is equally weighty, if evidence suggesting that something is true is heavily favoured due to bias in journal editors and researchers, then you can end up with a situation where the weight of the total evidence that X is not true actually outweighs the evidence that says that it is true, but if you only take the peer-reviewed literature, the weighting is actually opposite. As a result, unsurprisingly, if such censorship appears to be ideologically motivated, it's going to reduce public trust in science. That isn't rocket science. A recent review found that the journal Nature's unprecedented endorsement of a presidential candidate, namely Joe Biden in 2020, undermined trust in Nature specifically and scientists in general. So that's a review of a problem. What actually could be done about it? The authors of the paper make a number of suggestions. These include making the peer review process more transparent, publish editorial decision letters giving reasons for article rejections, for instance. This would enable analysis of editorial decisions by journal, potentially identifying those where non-scientific concerns and double standards, masking censorship, could be identified through analysis. Right now, only one journal, Meta-Psychology, shares peer reviews for rejected manuscripts. The option should be offered to all scholars to have reviews for their rejected articles made public. Now, some of them might not want that, which is fine, but those that feel their articles have been treated unfairly, they may well welcome it. Secondly, scholars should periodically audit scientific journals and institutions for procedural unfairness that prioritises outside factors, such as the perceived social benefit of certain conclusions. The aim is to introduce greater accountability for decision makers, while gaining a better understanding of what is being censored and why. The aim should be that such audits help to create competition amongst science journals, whose reputations would become influenced by the results of that analysis, and which would want to distinguish themselves from their peers by being more rigorous, more scientific, if you will. Research should be undertaken into article retractions and the reasons for these, looking specifically for where non-scientific concerns may be being disguised as scientific ones in retraction explanations. And also, we should check whether alleged harms have an actual basis in fact, or whether they are simply the result of untested presumptions. The fact is that potential harm is increasingly being cited as a reason to suppress research. Analysis of whether such harms truly existed has been non-existent. So that's the paper. Here's my take on this. The vast majority of scientific research is carried out in good faith and without bias, largely because the majority of research doesn't suffer from susceptibility to bias. If you're looking at, cellular degeneration of mollusks as they age, to take a completely random example off the top of my head, that's probably of low risk of bias. But the 5% that deals with highly sensitive societal issues, this is where the big risks are to be found. And because they're sensitive, they are, of course, also high profile. They therefore become important. So if bias is indulged in a systematic way in those areas, then that is what's likely to damage the reputation of all science, including the 95% that is of good integrity. I mean, look, in pure quantity terms, maybe that's 99%. I don't know. But the exact quantity isn't the point. The importance of the truth, whether we like it or not, is what science is meant to uphold. Human societies don't progress in a straight line. Maybe we won't either today. You get heights of discovery and civilization and enlightenment, and then you often get retreat, the re-emergence of superstition, the Dark Ages. Since we have more powerful weapons at our disposal than we've ever had before, and we're living right on the edge of planetary boundaries whose exact location we don't fully know, I'm going to put it out there and say this would be a pretty good time not to retreat into Dark Ages right now. If we fail that test and we give way to a new age of unreason, the scientists and the elites will no doubt blame the barbarians at the gates. But it's possible that the only reason those barbarians came to the gate in the first place was the abandonment of scientific principles by those who were supposed to be their champions. Once you've stopped serving the whole of humanity and you've picked a side, a political side, what exactly do you think the other side is going to do about that?